want to talk a little bit about privilege on demand. So every environment has use cases where you need to elevate permissions. Okay, how do you do that, right? How do you satisfy those requirements, or whether it's break glass, seasonal workers, contractors, task workers, right? Anytime, or simple use cases where a developer needs to build out infrastructure or needs additional permissions. How do you give them a vehicle to do that without persistently giving them too many permissions, right? Leaving your attack surface open to accidents or accounts being compromised. Okay, so this privilege on demand just-in-time workflow allows you to invoke a requester approver workflow based on any of the platforms we support. It all works the same way across all the various platforms. So in the context of AWS, what I'm simulating here is if I were a requester and I was utilizing the workflow within the CloudKnox admin console, I would only have access to this interface, right? Any of the other visibility sections, remediation sections, I wouldn't see that. I would log in and I would land here, okay? Now, if I had permission to make requests across different platforms, that would be exposed, okay? In this particular user has the ability to select the different platforms. If you only had access to one platform, only one would show up here, okay? Now I can select, in this particular case, I've got access to AWS and I'm given 3 different options. I can request a policy, okay? So in the context of AWS, I could go in here and I could request any policy, any AWS managed policy, custom policy, but again, you can control the scope of what can be requested. And just to note here as well, that in the context of AWS, we're requesting policy. If I were to pivot over to Azure, for example, okay, just to be clear, what we'll be doing in Azure is we'd be requesting a role, okay? And again, for folks that might not be familiar, it's just the different nuances between how AWS defines the roles versus Azure and GCP. So going back into AWS, in this particular case, again, you can request a policy, an entire policy. You can request a task, okay? And a task is just a function that's made available across all the different AWS services. So in this particular case, for example, if I look at the different services, if I look at S3, all I want to do is I don't need an entire policy. I just want permissions to create a bucket, delete a bucket, right? I might just need a couple of permissions, and we'll define those as tasks that you can request individually within the platform itself. Lastly, you could also request using a template. And so what the template allows you to do is it takes the onus away from the requester to know what permissions they need, okay? I'm a developer. I need to stand up some new infrastructure. I don't know what I need to stand up an EC2 instance, a database, an S3 bucket, right? There's different permissions. I might not be familiar with the necessary policies or the individual tasks. A template allows an administrator to group these policies, name it intuitively, so when the developer or whatever the use case is, right, when they come into the system, they'll request using that intuitively named template as opposed to having to pick a policy or task, right? Just really depending on what makes most sense in the environment. And again, we can force folks to provide a resource scope, right? So if you were, selecting different functions specific to a resource, we will make you pick a resource, right? Pick multiple resources in some cases if that's what you're after. But we can, for example, if you were going to delete a bucket, right? You've got to tell us what bucket you're going to delete, right? If you're going to delete an EC2 instance, tell us what that is, okay? But in this particular format, when I get through that request summary, right, I'm just, I need to create a new bucket, okay? And then you decide what that time criteria is. You need it immediately for a set period of time. You need it on a recurring basis, daily, weekly, monthly, right? You decide what that looks like, okay? Now, simply put, this is what the request is going to look like. This is what the approver is going to see, okay? So I also want to note that this workflow that we support, out of the box, we have our own requester approver roles. If you have the approval role, you're notified, you review the request, and you approve it or you deny it. If it's approved and if it's a time bound approval, then the requester will be notified. Their permissions will go into effect. When the time lapses, we're going to pull that policy away from that user, get those permissions detached from the identity. Okay, notify the user that the time's lapsed, 4 hours is up, your permissions are now gone. If you need to elevate your permissions again, submit another request. Okay, and the other piece, as we talked earlier, when we talked about remediation, this section as well is also extensible. And what I mean by that is if you want to support this workflow somewhere else, I mean, notably, a really prevalent use case for this is we have some native integration with ServiceNow. So this this requester approver workflow is also supported outside of CloudKnox. If you already have a ticketing system, if you already have an asset management platform, however you make these types of requests today, if you have a system that does that, well, we're going to harness that. Okay. But again, a lot of customers will utilize the embedded workflow that we provide within CloudKnox as well. But that's really what that requester approver workflow looks like.